Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be concluding our discussion of personality psychology by talking about another major movement that's happened within the field since its early inception. In particular, we're going to be looking at the topic of traits. Before we do this, though, I do want to kind of provide us with a roadmap of how we got to discussing traits in this last lecture on personality psychology. If you remember back to our last class, we talked about the journey from Freud to our current day versions of personality psychology. And we concluded in that lecture with a branch of personality psychology called the social cognitive approach. Now, I mentioned in that specific lecture that this transition to the social cognitive approach was our first real focus on trying to address personality topics through some type of verifiable research. It's not that other theories had no merit to them. It's not that people like Carl Rogers and his humanistic movement don't still have a place in our discussion of personality psychology today, like many of the other people we've talked about. But the social cognitive movement really was a stark contrast to a lot of the other personality theories that were important in our kind of early inception of what personality psychology should be all about. And, when we started going over to this new perspective, it led lots of other individuals to talk about alternative ways to study individual differences that maybe weren't as celebrated in the early years of personality psychology. And this brings us to, again, what we're going to be focusing on today. If we look at all of the early ideas that we've discussed so far, and in fact all the inklings of what personality psychologists studied for many decades, the main focus for most individuals at that time was not on necessarily how we could separate out people or what these things meant for them, but instead sort of how people got there, what led them to becoming the specific person they were. And that is an important part of this area of psychology and personality, but it's important to note that that's not necessarily the only thing that one could study when looking at personality psychology. If we look back at the definition of personality psychology and what a person's personality is, what we see is sort of an untapped component to personality that merited some further investigation that we hadn't quite gotten to. If we talk about a person's personality, what we're talking about is certain combinations of characteristics or qualities that kind of make them not only unique from others, but kind of are used to predict how they might behave across a wide variety of different situations. And if we want to be specific as to what these characteristics are, well, we often talk about these things called traits. These kind of words or terms we can use to define a person's consistencies across situations and over time that really define who they are. Now, you might have noticed that a lot of the ideas of Freud and Jung and Rogers could theoretically be tied to the notion of traits. And in fact, if we talk about the social cognitive movement, we can talk about where these traits might emerge. But it doesn't mean that we had necessarily a really consistent way of studying traits, at least in a scientific manner, when personality started to take shape in the 1960s and 70s. But it's not that there wasn't an idea there, it's just it hadn't been necessarily celebrated or embraced like some of the other personality ideas that were out there. But to understand how we started shifting our focus away from the causes of personality into just how we can describe individual differences and what we could use them for, we have to go back to about the time of Freud, just a little bit later, and look at the work of a very influential person who sort of took some time to take hold. And this person's name was Gordon Allport. Allport was born on November 11th, 1897, in a smaller-ish suburb in Indiana named Montezuma. He came from a relatively small family, at least for the time, but one that was very versed in academics. In fact, many of his siblings not only pursued college degrees, but graduate degrees, doctorates, or MDs, and pursued really lucrative and successful careers on their own. Harvard's path to success came through not only his undergraduate work at Harvard, where he got a degree in both philosophy and economics in 1919, but in his sort of international travel and his interest in sort of up-and-coming ideas that could merge science with philosophy in other areas, hence psychology. He taught a year after graduating from Harvard at Robert College, which was in Istanbul, and then he started thinking about different graduate programs that he could pursue after he had sort of built up his resume. And like many individuals interested in psychology at the time, in the early 1900s, he started to become enamored with the very famous name that we've talked about so far, Sigmund Freud. And this led to sort of his first introduction into personality psychology that started this kind of really dramatic shift in his life. And to understand how this dramatic shift happened, we have to appreciate that even though Allport was striving, like many at the time, to work with Sigmund Freud in his Psychodynamic Institute in Vienna that we talked about previously, he, unlike most individuals we've discussed so far, was extremely unimpressed with Freud right off the bat. In many of his writings, he talked about this breakthrough moment he had when meeting with Freud, trying to convince him to get him into the psychodynamic movement, where he came to the conclusion during the conversation that this person that he had aspired to work with, this person that had essentially championed this new take on psychology in both personality and clinical work, was sort of a charlatan and definitely not somebody that would be trusted and somebody that he could really feel comfortable pursuing for the majority of his career. So instead of working with Freud, which was sort of the trend for many successful people in the United States at the time who were interested in psychology, Allport decided to actually go back to the United States and pursue something that was pretty unique in the early 1900s. And that was a PhD in psychology at Harvard. And he was able to, because of his volition and just his academic skills, get through the PhD program at Harvard in 2 years. Now, for those some of you that need some context on that, understand that that's sort of unheard of today. It wasn't extremely rare back then. It could be done, but most people historically have finished a PhD in somewhere around 5 to 6 or 7 years. 2 years is an extremely fast amount of time to get through. Because what you often need to do is form some line of research, come up with some ideas that are sort of groundbreaking or just unique at least, and pursue them through a variety of different research studies that eventually will lead to a number of different publications. Allport was able to do all of this in 2 years, partially because of his motivation to not only sort of prove Freud wrong, but also his decision to try to reinvent what personality psychology was all about. And this is where we get to the topic that we'll be discussing throughout the class, this idea of something that was called traits. It's not that this term was unique and Allport introduced it. We had the idea of traits for a long time. But Allport was one of the first individuals to suggest that if we wanted to study personality psychology in a scientific manner, focusing our attention on traits was paramount. He suggested that just finding ways to classify people, to measure traits, to use these in different situations was a critical thing for personality psychology to sort of get out of the original muck and mire that Freud sort of brought it into when he introduced the world to personality psychology through his own lens. And because of this push to be more scientific, many people started to call him the first true personality psychologist. Now, to be fair, when he was pushing this, he was pretty much rejected by most of his colleagues and many individuals. It wasn't that they thought he wasn't being scientific in his approach, it's just there wasn't this recognition of the merit of his ideas when he started to introduce them in the early 1920s. So for a long time, he sort of worked around the edges, trying to build up some repertoire of research and information that could be used if personality psychology did ever shift into his approach, and we would potentially ever call him the first personality psychologist. But what does it mean then for people to 20, 30 years later really give him that title? Well, when we look at Allport's work, one of the things that made him unique beyond just looking at personality from a more scientific perspective was his decision to sort of steer clear of what many personality psychologists had tended to do in the early years of this branch, and that was study sort of the atypical. Oftentimes, it's tough in a personality psychology class to convince students of the differentiation between personality psychology and clinical psych. And that's because many of our early theorists did focus their attention on clinical topics. It's why when we talk about the formation of personality psychology, it's also intertwined with the formation of new takes on clinical psychology. But Allport sort of changed that conversation. He suggested we should focus our attention on most individuals, people who he called healthy, that didn't necessarily display some prominent thing that was so unusual we were trying desperately to figure out where it came from. He suggested all of us have unique quirks, consistencies within us. And he thought just focusing on those consistencies of everyday people was a much more kind of fruitful endeavor and had a lot more potential in kind of carving out something that made personality psychology unique. But while he was doing this, he also thought that it was important to merge personality psychology with other up-and-coming branches of psychology. He was one of the first individuals to suggest that we could potentially have physiological structures in our brain that were sort of primed to bring out certain personality traits within us. Now, he wasn't the first person to suggest that our biology could be linked to individual differences. You might have heard in other classes about theorists like Gall, who suggested we could actually look at a person's brain and their skull itself to try to guess what somebody was like. Phrenology still even has its takes today. But Allport was really unique in suggesting that maybe just activation of certain areas of the brain, different kind of patterns within the brain, could be linked to traits. And it's important to note that actually some research has seemed to prove him true on some of these things. We do see individual differences in brain activity that could potentially be linked back to personality. He also was one of the first individuals to talk about traits being not just inherited in the basic conceptual terms that we did before, but something that could be linked to things like genes, something that we had just started to talk about and look at as scientists as his career was starting to kind of blossom. He also talked about using mathematical tools that we were developing to really try to understand traits and use them for predictive purposes. He talked about not only wanting to know how to describe somebody, but talking about the frequency of their traits, the intensity, the range of these things, as you see listed here on this slide, were critical tools that Allport said we could use to really not just talk about what made somebody different, but use it for predictive purposes. Try to understand maybe where you'd be successful in school, or who you'd like to get along with, or what things you might be more inclined to be drawn to as you age. These ideas of Allport's that seem kind of common knowledge to us today, that we just kind of intuitively link to personality psychology, were very game-changing at the time. And it took a long time for his ideas to really take hold. But today, many people in personality psychology, especially those that study traits, tend to give Allport that name of really being the first true personality psychologist because of all these different pushes that he tried to really put on the field as his career was starting to grow. But there are some things that kind of make Allport's ideas sort of challenging for today's personality psychologist. One of the things that Allport was very insistent on when he was studying traits was that when we wanted to understand things and predict stuff with the traits we were measuring, we had to treat each person as unique. Now, there's a lot of merit to this. Many of us do have certain things within us that are very prominent and important that aren't necessarily something that we see in others. Not that it's gone in them, it's just not a focal point for them, not a trait that really is critical. So in Allport's work, Most of his focus was on finding ways to get at the key individual differences that each person presented. This led us to situations where each person had, say, a wide range of different traits that could be linked to them that had different levels of intensity that kind of merited different weights when we tried to predict things like, again, who you'd be friends with, what programs you'd get into, or where you'd be much later on in life. And this focus on kind of treating each person individually, this insistence that some people could have 4 really important defining traits while others could have 10 or 20, created a sort of a problem for people who try to take this idea of traits and put it into some type of scientific program. Because if each person was treated uniquely, talking about predictive value of different trait assessments became really challenging. And talking about how we could use this information for large-scale groups became even more challenging. Because if we wanted to use traits to predict things like who would get along in school or what major might be best for somebody, we needed to have some sort of consistency in what we were measuring in each person. It didn't mean that everybody was necessarily the same and we should all be focusing on just the same dimensions for everybody. It was just for predictive purposes, for utility purposes. This was a critical thing. And this problem that was sort of confronting Allport's early ideas led to a lot of individuals, as trait psychology started to pick up in popularity, to suggest that even though Allport might not be wrong in his thinking, he might be sort of short-sighted in looking at how we could use personality psychology for more scientific purposes. And this led to researchers for a number of years, actually a couple decades, trying to find ways to sort of look for a universal set of traits that we could use in everybody. Now, if we were taking a personality class, we could talk about this long journey through a number of individuals like Hans Eysenck and Raymond Cattell and other really groundbreaking names that sort of shifted the conversation of not only what traits we should focus on in people, but how we could go about acquiring those traits. Since we're trying to be at least a little bit simplistic in this class so we can narrow things down, I thought we'd focus our attention when talking about where we eventually got to when trying to be more scientific in traits with sort of the big thing that exists today. A topic that you'll probably hear about many times as you pass through school, called the Big Five. And this Big Five, this list of 5 traits that many researchers will use, just measuring people on how high or low they are to kind of determine a lot of different things about them, is not something that just came out of thin air. It's actually something that came through a very logical progression that Gordon Allport himself started. Allport contended that if we wanted to really find a universal set of traits that we could measure everybody on and use it for predictive values, we should look to the source of traits, namely language, words we could use to describe people. So what Allport and one of his colleagues did in the mid-1900s is have a number of graduate and undergraduate students sift through the English dictionary and look for a kind of exhaustive list of all the words that could potentially be used to describe an individual's personality. And there was some disagreement from person to person, but eventually they compiled a list of approximately 18,000 different words that they suggested could be used as traits. And Allport sort of contended that this could be a launching point for future research on the topic. He also thought that this sort of suggested that this might be an insurmountable mountain if we tried to find a way to describe people on these 18,000 different words. But many people, when they started to look at Allport's publications and ideas, started to recognize that those 18,000 words weren't all necessarily unique. One of those individuals was a gentleman who, again, if we were in a personality class, we'd have a lot more time to talk about. His name was Raymond Cattell. Cattell's contributions varied in the field, but when we get back to the Big Five, his big part in this was identifying that those 18,000 words had lots of overlaps. Some words meant essentially the same thing. We tend to call them synonyms. Other words meant kind of the exact opposite of each other. We call them antonyms. So he went through the list of 18,000 words and would say things like, well, if I see nice and friendly, I'm going to assume that we need to just use one of those to measure a person. Nobody's going to say they're really nice and not friendly at all, or they're not nice but they are really friendly. If you're kind of going to be one and the other, or neither. So he said, let's just talk about measuring people on one nice scale and get rid of the word friendly. Same thing with those antonyms. Nobody's going to say they're really nice and really mean. They're going to say they're either really nice and not mean, or really mean and not nice, or somewhere in between. So again, we can do away with the word mean and just for all three of those words, use the word nice. And this whittling down process that Cattell did brought us to not just a manageable number, but a really small number of traits that we could use to describe people. 35 to be specific. Now, there was some debate as to whether or not that 35 was perfectly whittled down, but it was, for most people, a pretty nice list. But one for scientific endeavors that was still too big, too broad. So researchers started to look for other tools, other avenues that we could use to get that list down even more. And this is where the merger of personality psychology, in particular trait psychology, and science really took shape. As personality psychology was starting to grow, so was statistics. So were computers and tools that could allow us to do computations that we could have never imagined before. And one particular computation that started to become much easier to do in the 1960s and 70s and beyond was this thing called a factor analysis, where we could actually look for correlations and responses of individuals between questions and weigh out which terms, which ideas overlapped the most amongst all the different things that were there, and if there were any things that sort of separated out from the different response patterns that people were giving. So what Costa and McCrae did, two very influential individuals in personality psychology as well, is they looked at these 35 different traits, asked people to rate themselves on how high or low they were on them, large numbers of individuals, hundreds, thousands of people, and then did this very fancy factor analysis with their computers and started to find trends. In particular, they found out that a bunch of traits that didn't necessarily look on the surface like they were similar tended to provide kind of overlapping responses from person to person. And that led to them to contend that even though the terms might not be identical on the surface, they were getting at roughly the same thing. And that allowed them to merge a bunch of new stuff together and eventually whittle this down to what we nowadays call the Big Five. 5 personality traits that aren't necessarily present in all of us, but that we can measure everybody on and use that for a bunch of predictive purposes. And this might lead you to ask the very important question of, well, what are these 5 different traits? If we look at the Big Five, there's a number of different ways that it's spelled out that can help you sort of remember it through a mnemonic device. One of the ways that people often talk about personality being easy to measure is when we say that your personality spans the ocean, a phrase that I actually told you a long time ago in the memory lecture. Now, you might have grown back then, and I'm guessing you're growing now, but that word, ocean, actually sums up the entire Big Five. O standing for openness to experience, C standing for conscientiousness, E standing for extroversion, A standing for agreeableness, and N standing for neuroticism. Now, that's not the only way you can rearrange these words or these lists to make a word that's kind of more memorable. You might also hear of this as the canoe traits, C-A-N-O-E. Same thing, you got all 5 of the traits listed there. But what I want you to get through this isn't the mnemonic device as much as the 5 traits that are here in this Big Five. What researchers have contended ever since this was introduced is that even though these do not get at every single thing that's unique to a person, measuring people on these 5 traits and the subcategories within them, the ones that you can see to the right, those things could help us use kind of people's descriptors for predictive purposes. We can talk about which friends you might get along with, or which classes you might thrive in, or what things you're going to pursue later on. And this kind of new list of traits has found its way into a lot of different research studies. Because again, we don't talk about if you have openness or not, we just talk about how strong or low you are on this specific measure. We'll usually say, you're somewhere between 1 to 7 in openness to experience, meaning you like trying new stuff, or you're creative, or you're willing to kind of explore ideas that you haven't explored before. If you're high in conscientiousness, it means that you're very orderly. You like to have things kind of planned out, and you're usually somebody that's really trying to accomplish a lot. If you're low in conscientiousness, and the opposite tends to be true. Which again, you don't have to be quite on those extremes. You could be in the middle on this one. And this goes for all 5 of these traits. And what the researchers studying this suggest is that even though people might put some type of connotation to where we are in these traits, it's good to be high in this or low in this or whatever, what they're more interested in is just measuring how you describe yourself and using that for predictive values. And there have been a lot of studies to kind of show that knowing where somebody lies on this can have its utility. Maybe not perfect utility, as we're going to discuss a little bit later. In fact, there are some major shortcomings to it. But it's a really sort of scientific way of studying a very complex thing. And this might lead you to think that, well, we've all just embraced the Big Five, and that's all you need to know about if you want to get into personality psychology. As I've mentioned before, that's certainly not the case. There are still many personality psychologists who focus on social cognitive ideas. There are also many individuals who study traits that suggest that the Big Five is problematic if that's the only thing we want to use to understand individuals. And some of their complaints have to do with predictive values in specific situations, but others have to do with how the Big Five was derived in the first place. One of the things that people recognized when we started to focus on the Big Five a little bit more was that even though the way we came up with the Big Five was pretty intuitive, it sort of missed a big problem when we came up with it. And that was the fact that we were focusing on coming up with this through just one language, in particular the English language. People started asking, well, what happens if we look at this in Mandarin? What happens if we look for this in Spanish? What happens if we look for this in a completely different language that isn't necessarily exposed to Western cultures? And this led a lot of researchers to try to replicate how we got to the Big Five. And what we found, which was kind of surprising, is that the Big Five did, at least to an extent, emerge in many cultures through this same analysis tool. It is important to note that most cultures that seem to have the Big Five are what we want to call usually the Romance languages, lots of European languages and other areas that kind of had a lot of overlap over the years. But even in more disparate cultures that didn't necessarily have a lot of European influence, something very similar to the Big Five popped up. But however, some cultures had things that did seem to also be unique. Religiousness levels did seem to be a prominent thing that was a defining characteristic in many cultures, even though we didn't have it in our studies. Humor levels was another thing that seemed to kind of be this unique thing that formed and was important in using for predictive values in other in other cultures. And there were sometimes situations where certain traits that we kept as unique merged in other cultures. But for the most part, the fact that we found the Big Five is interesting. But again, finding differences from different cultures suggests some sort of egocentric thinking in the approach and some potential pitfalls if we want to use this research for predictive purposes beyond just the culture that we're in. And again, even if we use it for our own culture, many people publishing on the Big Five have highlighted how there is a cap in predicting where somebody's going to be, what somebody's going to do just by using the Big Five. It's useful. It's there, but I certainly wouldn't be betting a large amount of money on knowing where you are in the Big Five and what major you're going to choose, or who you're going to be friends with, because there are a lot of situational factors that seem to trump personality in many of the things that we do from day to day. And this is a persistent problem in trait research that still exists today and has led people to saying, well, maybe the Big Five can be used for big scale stuff, but maybe we should look for specific traits if we're interested in a specific situation. Or maybe we should look at kind of a combination of traits and situational factors if we really want to be scientific in our predictive attempts on kind of how somebody might land in a specific situation. But it also brings us to a really interesting topic when we start talking about merging personality psychology with things like social psychology. And that's the fact that as the Big Five started to grow in popularity, lots of people started to look at other things we could merge personality psychology with. As we mentioned before, Gordon Allport was a huge advocate of looking for genetic impacts on traits and looking at how our brain might respond differently to things that could give us a sense of why traits emerged in the first place. Many researchers have followed that path that Allport took and shown that there does seem to be in heritability research a pretty heavy genetic factor in a lot of the traits that we persist with, and it seems that the Big Five does have lots of genetic components to it. But it's also important to note when we talk about heritability research that there's lots of indicators within twin studies and other sibling studies that unshared environments and unique experiences that people encounter have a very heavy weight on them as well, and looking at where people become the people they are. And if we're looking for where some of these unshared experiences are coming from, this leads us to another really important topic in trait research that's been studied a lot, something called the learning theory of traits. It's this notion that not only is our social environment a very important factor in some of the things we do, but it's an important factor in how we're forming lots of traits. In particular, this learning theory highlights that the groups we start to find ourselves intertwined with, the ways we start to define ourselves, can have a huge impact on the traits that emerge within us, but also a very important impact on the way we perceive ourselves on certain traits. Let's say, for example, you're a part of a group that's very athletic. Well, you're probably, because of that group when you're in junior high and high school, let's say, going to define yourself as fairly athletic. You're going to pursue lots of things because you're a part of that group that will bring out traits that tend to be prominent in people that are athletic or just kind of hanging with that group of people. But what's equally interesting with this learning theory is that even though these traits are going to emerge within you, you might, when sort of judging yourself with others, not necessarily identify those things emerging, or even recognize that you're very high in certain characteristics that other people don't possess. And this is because as you're kind of aligning your behaviors with them, that eventually leads to your traits, you're using these same people sort of as an anchor, a gauge as to how high or low you are on specific traits. So if you're, say, in a group of individuals that's very creative and very outgoing, well, you'll pursue things that very creative and outgoing people pursue, but when you're asked point blank how creative you are, you tend to not compare yourself to everybody in the world, but instead to that group of friends. And if you're just in the middle of that group, or even in the lower end of that group, you might very, very dramatically underestimate how outgoing you are. This is why many personality psychologists, when looking at this, have thought of new ways to measure traits. They've gone away from just asking people to describe themselves and into asking people to describe how often they do things, how often they pursue things related to specific traits. And in doing so, they can sort of overcome some of these anchoring effects. And all this, hopefully, kind of highlights this really cool merger that many personality psychologists have seen over the last couple decades between not only personality psychology and social psychology, but also things like developmental psychology and clinical psychology. And when personality psychology took a more scientific turn through this trait approach and also through the social cognitive approach, it allowed for people to sort of intertwine this branch of psychology that's very critical in understanding who we are and what we're like with all the other areas that can help with that conversation. And it's allowed this branch of psychology to really blossom over the last 20 to 30 years. It's allowed it to not only distinguish itself from clinical psychology, but be used just as much as things like social psychology in kind of looking at everyday encounters and everyday experiences that really are paramount to understanding the human experience and the human mind. And this is where we're going to sort of close up with this topic of personality psychology, a foray into this new scientific world that really is personality psychology today. I want to reiterate, personality psychology is not synonymous with trait psychology. There are other types of personality psychologists out there. But hopefully, in this journey that we took today, you can understand how we got from Freud to Allport to, well, our current version of trait psychology, and how, well, we got from the original conception of personality psychology to the very diversified world of personality psychology today that not only looks at the causes of personality, but the ways we can use our understanding of personality for a variety of purposes. Same general ideas, sort of how we're going to apply our last topic that we'll be discussing in the last 3 classes of clinical psychology. But we've sort of done a lot of the early footwork for clinical psychology in the previous lectures. We've sort of, through the early lectures, seen how clinical psychology started to take shape, at least our current version of clinical psychology started to take shape. So in our next couple classes, we're going to be looking at more current topics, trends in clinical psychology that isn't necessarily going to make anybody a clinical psychologist by the end, but going to give us at least a broader sense of what this field is all about and some of the important topics that we want you to know before leaving this general psychology class. But when we get into this area, it's really important that we understand everything that we're exploring, because misinformation can be a big problem in this branch. So to make this not only more entertaining, but to also really help increase your knowledge, I encourage you strongly before we get into the videos to do the readings. And if you don't quite get to them before you watch the next video, please do the readings on this topic, because it is a sensitive and important topic that we want to treat appropriately. Hopefully in the next lecture, I'll see you ready to go as we get into our very last branch of psychology in clinical psych. Until then, take care, and I hope to see you soon.